My neighbor blocked me in my own driveway for 6 hours, and instead of apologizing for my mistake, I turned it into a 3-year war that destroyed my marriage, my mental health, and my entire life while he moved on completely unbothered. I was blocked in my own driveway for 6 hours because my neighbor decided that my repeated parking mistakes gave him the right to trap me there, and instead of handling it like an over 18, I let that moment turn into 3 years of escalating warfare that destroyed my life, my marriage, and my mental health. I had every right to be angry. What I didn't have was the right to do what I did next. His name is Tom, and he lives in the house directly behind mine. We share a driveway that splits into 2 separate parking areas. My space is on the left. His space is on the right. It's a simple arrangement that should have been easy to navigate. But I have terrible spatial awareness. I've always had it. I can't judge distances. I can't estimate where my car actually ends and where the next space begins. So I started parking partially in Tom's space. Not intentionally. Just carelessly. The first few times, it wasn't a big deal. I'd park a little over the line. Tom would just park in front of the garage or park on the street. He never said anything. I never thought to address it. I just assumed it was fine. I was wrong about that. After about 3 months of me consistently parking partially in his space, Tom left a note. It was polite but firm. It said, "I appreciate your understanding, but I need my full parking space. Please be more careful with your parking." I read it and felt embarrassed. I apologized mentally and told myself I'd do better. I didn't do better. I kept parking over the line because I genuinely struggle with it. And Tom kept dealing with it. He'd move his car. He'd park elsewhere. He'd never confront me directly. He just quietly accommodated my incompetence. But I could tell it was bothering him. I could see it in his expression when he'd come outside and realize that his space was partially blocked. I could see the frustration. And instead of addressing it directly, instead of asking him to help me understand the spatial boundaries, instead of taking responsibility for my repeated mistakes, I got defensive. I told myself that he was being petty. I told myself that he should just say something directly instead of leaving passive-aggressive notes. I told myself that it wasn't that big of a deal. I made his legitimate frustration into something unreasonable in my mind so I wouldn't have to confront my own carelessness. One Tuesday morning, I woke up late for work. I was in a rush. I ran outside and jumped in my car without paying attention to the parking lines. I parked so far over into Tom's space that he would have been unable to fit in his spot at all. I didn't even think about it. I just rushed off to work thinking about my meetings and my schedule. Tom came home at lunchtime to grab something. He found his parking space completely blocked by my car. He couldn't fit. He couldn't park. He couldn't access his own driveway. He called me. He was calm but his voice was tight. He said, "Your car is blocking my entire parking space. I need you to move it immediately." I was in a meeting. I told him I couldn't leave work right then. He said, "I need to move my car. This needs to be resolved now." I told him I'd come move it at lunch, which wasn't for another 2 hours. He said that wasn't acceptable. I got annoyed. I told him that I'd move it when I could and that he was being dramatic about it. Then I hung up. Tom didn't call back. But what he did do was park behind my car. He pulled into our shared driveway and parked directly behind my car, blocking me in completely. He left a note on my windshield that said, "Now you know how it feels." And I understood, in that moment, that I'd finally pushed him far enough that he was willing to retaliate. And instead of being ashamed of what I'd done, instead of apologizing and taking responsibility, I got furious. I left work early. I drove home angry. I found Tom outside getting his mail, and I started yelling at him. I asked him what he thought he was doing. I told him that he couldn't just trap people in their own driveways. I told him he was being petty and vindictive. I made myself the victim of his response to my behavior. Tom tried to explain. He said, "You've been parking in my space for months. I've asked nicely. I've left notes. You clearly don't care. I needed you to understand how it feels to be trapped." I didn't hear him. I was too angry. I told him that he had no right to trap me in my driveway and that if he did it again, I'd call the police. Then I moved my car and parked carefully in my own space, but I was seething. And that's when I should have let it go. That's when I should have reflected on what had happened and realized that Tom was right. That's when I should have apologized and made a commitment to parking more carefully. But I didn't. I let my anger fester. I started researching property lines. I started looking up driveway laws. I started documenting every time Tom parked even slightly over the line into my space. I took photos. I kept a log. I was preparing for war. 3 weeks later, Tom parked slightly over the line. Not nearly as egregiously as I'd been doing, but definitely in my space. And I parked directly behind him, the same way he'd done to me. I left a note that said, "See how it feels?" Tom came out immediately. He moved his car. Then he called the police and reported me for blocking his driveway. The police came and assessed the situation. They said that technically I wasn't breaking the law, but they suggested that we work it out between ourselves. Tom came home and found himself completely blocked in. He called the police again. The police came and told me I needed to move my car immediately. I complied, but with an attitude. I made it clear that I resented being told what to do. That's when Tom did something I didn't expect. He stopped engaging with me entirely. He stopped trying to resolve anything. He stopped leaving notes. He stopped calling the police. He just stopped acknowledging that I existed. And somehow, his complete disengagement was worse than his anger would have been. Because it meant that he'd given up. He'd decided that I wasn't worth talking to. He'd decided that coexistence was impossible. My marriage was deteriorating around the same time. Rebecca was tired of the constant conflict with Tom. She was tired of me being angry all the time. She was tired of me refusing to take responsibility. She suggested marriage counseling. I refused. I told her that the problem wasn't us. The problem was Tom. She looked at me with a kind of sadness and said, "The problem is you. You can't take responsibility for anything. You just blame everyone else." That landed. But instead of reflecting on it, instead of understanding that she was right, I got defensive. I told her that she was taking Tom's side. I told her that she didn't support me. I made her concern into a betrayal. She stopped trying after that. She just existed in the house in a state of quiet disappointment. And I continued the conflict with Tom, knowing that my marriage was falling apart because of it, but unable to stop myself. By the end of year 2, I'd moved my car to a different spot just to avoid parking near Tom. I'd avoided leaving the house when he was outside. I'd become someone who was completely controlled by this conflict. My entire life had been reorganized around hating and fighting with my neighbor. And Tom had just moved on. He'd redecorated his house. He'd gotten a better job. He'd rebuilt his life in a way that didn't include engaging with me at all. While I was still fuming about parking spaces, Tom had decided I wasn't worth his energy. That should have been my wake-up call. That should have been the moment I understood how unhealthy I'd become. But instead, I escalated further. In year 3, I started calling the HOA about Tom's parking. I claimed that he was violating driveway regulations. I filed formal complaints. I documented every time his car went even slightly over the line. I was determined to get him in trouble with the HOA, determined to prove that he was the problem, determined to win a conflict that had stopped being about parking years ago. The HOA investigated. They found that Tom's parking was mostly within the lines. They found no violations. They also found, in the process of reviewing all complaints, that I had been the original problem. That I had been the one parking in his space consistently for months. That Tom's response had been appropriate and measured. The HOA rep called me and politely suggested that I was the one violating driveway regulations and that I needed to correct my behavior. I felt humiliated. I felt like I'd been betrayed by the HOA. But really, I'd been betrayed by my own refusal to take responsibility 3 years earlier. Rebecca had had enough by then. She told me that she wanted a divorce. She said that she couldn't be married to someone who was so determined to be right that he was willing to destroy his own life to prove it. She said that she'd suggested counseling and I'd refused. She said that she'd tried to talk to me about apologizing and I'd refused. She said that I'd created this entire conflict through my own carelessness and then spent 3 years refusing to acknowledge it. She was absolutely right. And I still couldn't admit it. I told her that she was abandoning me. I told her that I needed her support. I told her that I was the victim in this situation. I made her decision to leave into something I could blame her for instead of acknowledging that I'd driven her away through my own behavior. She moved out a week later. She took our dog. She took half the furniture. She started divorce proceedings. And suddenly, I was alone in a house with a neighbor I hated and a wife who'd left me because I couldn't take responsibility for anything. That's when I should have had my come to Jesus moment. That's when I should have understood what I'd done. But instead, I spiraled further. I started researching Tom's background. I found his social media accounts. I read everything he posted. I looked at photos of his life. I was stalking him in a way that was disturbingly similar to obsession. And I was doing it because I needed him to be the villain in this story. I needed him to have done something wrong so I could justify my own behavior. I didn't find anything. Tom was just a normal guy living a normal life, completely unbothered by the conflict I was determined to maintain. I started leaving passive-aggressive notes on his car. I'd complain about his landscaping or his parking or the time he came home. I'd make it clear through these notes that I was watching him, that I was documenting his behavior, that I was still angry. Tom never responded. He just ignored the notes. And his silence was infuriating because it meant that I didn't matter to him at all. I was so focused on him, and he had completely moved on from me. My friends started distancing themselves. They'd ask me how I was doing, and I'd launch into the same story about Tom blocking me in and parking in my space. They'd try to suggest that I move on, that I apologize, that I let it go. And I'd get defensive with them too. I'd accuse them of not understanding, of taking Tom's side, of not supporting me. One by one, I isolated myself from everyone except my anger at Tom. By month 18 of year 3, I'd been living in the same house for 2 years and I'd become someone I didn't recognize. I was consumed by the conflict with Tom. I was thinking about him constantly. I was planning ways to retaliate. I was researching his work and his hobbies and everything about him that I could find. I was, essentially, obsessed with him. And I was using the original parking conflict as justification for that obsession. My therapist asked me once, "What would it take for you to let this go?" And I realized that I didn't know. I'd spent 3 years building this conflict into something so big, so important, so central to my identity, that I didn't know who I was without it. I started seeing a therapist around year 3 because my mental health was completely deteriorating. I was having panic problems. I was having trouble sleeping. I was having intrusive thoughts about Tom and parking spaces and driveways. The therapist gently suggested that the original conflict wasn't actually about parking. It was about my inability to take responsibility. I argued with her. I told her that Tom had trapped me in my driveway. I told her that he'd started the retaliation. I told her that this was all his fault. And she listened patiently and then asked me, "How did he trap you in your driveway?" I told her that he'd parked behind me. She asked, "Why?" I told her that I'd parked in his space and refused to move my car for hours. She asked, "Why did you park in his space?" And I had to admit that I'd been careless. That I'd been parking in his space for months. That he'd asked me nicely to stop. That I'd refused to acknowledge my mistake. And when I said all of that out loud, I finally understood. This entire 3-year conflict was my fault. Not Tom's fault. Mine. I had created this situation through carelessness and then compounded it through stubbornness. And I'd spent 3 years refusing to take responsibility. I wanted to reach out to Tom. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to tell him that he was right, that I was wrong, that I'd been behaving like a child. But 3 years of warfare made that impossible. How could I go to him now and say sorry? How could I undo 3 years of conflict, of notes, of retaliation, of escalation? I couldn't. And that was the devastating realization. I'd spent 3 years making this situation worse, and now it was too late to fix it. Tom wouldn't believe an apology. Tom had moved on. Tom wouldn't care that I'd finally understood what I'd done wrong. I tried anyway. I wrote him a letter. I told him that I was sorry for parking in his space. I told him that I was sorry for retaliating when he blocked me in. I told him that I was sorry for filing complaints with the HOA. I told him that I was sorry for being unable to take responsibility. I told him that I understood it was too late to fix things, but that I wanted him to know that I was sorry. I left the letter on his doorstep. He never responded. He never acknowledged that he'd received it. He just continued living his life, completely unaffected by my 3-year obsession with him. My divorce was finalized 6 months later. Rebecca got the house in the settlement. I got a small apartment across town. I had to move away from the driveway that had consumed 3 years of my life. And I realized, moving away, that I was doing the same thing I'd done with Tom's silence. I was running away instead of accepting that I'd created this situation and destroyed my own life in the process. I'm 38 years old now. I'm living alone in an apartment. I don't have my wife. I don't have my friends. I don't have my marriage. I have a job that I show up to in a state of constant anxiety. I have a therapist I see twice a week. I have a deep understanding of how my refusal to take responsibility has destroyed my life. And I still think about the parking conflict sometimes. I still think about Tom. I still wish I could go back to that Tuesday morning when I parked carelessly and had been able to handle it like an over 18. Tom's life went on. He got promoted. He seems happy. He has friends over. He's living the life that I should have been living if I'd just been able to take responsibility for my mistakes and move forward. But I can't move forward. I'm still stuck in that conflict. I'm still angry about being blocked in my driveway. I'm still unable to accept that it was my fault. The worst part is knowing that I had so many opportunities to handle this differently. I had the opportunity when Tom left the first note. I had the opportunity when he blocked me in. I had the opportunity when Rebecca asked me to apologize. I had the opportunity when the HOA told me that I was the problem. I had opportunities at every single step to take responsibility, to apologize, to move forward. And I refused every single one of them. I chose anger. I chose blame. I chose to make myself the victim of a situation that I had created. If you're reading this and you've had a conflict with a neighbor, if you've had a conflict with anyone, and your first instinct is to blame them, to retaliate, to escalate, I'm begging you to stop. Take responsibility for what you've done. Apologize. Move on. Don't become someone who's consumed by a conflict that started with a parking mistake. Because the cost of not being able to let go is everything. It's your marriage. It's your friendships. It's your mental health. It's your peace of mind. It's your entire life. And the person you're fighting with? They move on. They forget about you. They build a life that doesn't include you at all. While you're still fuming about something that happened 3 years ago, they're out living their best life, completely unbothered by your existence. That's the cruelest irony of all. That I destroyed my own life trying to upset someone who didn't care. That I isolated myself trying to win a conflict that Tom had stopped fighting years ago. That I've become someone who is defined entirely by my inability to take responsibility for a parking mistake. Don't do what I did. Don't turn a small mistake into a 3-year war with yourself. Don't let your pride prevent you from apologizing. Don't let your need to be right destroy everything that matters to you. Because 3 years later, divorced and alone and still thinking about parking spaces, I can tell you with absolute certainty, it's not worth it.